morning. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Teresa. And I want to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. This is my first opportunity to come to the South American Systemic Functional Linguistics Conference. And I'm looking forward to meeting you and hearing about the work you're doing. I chose my title today to build on the conference theme, which is building meanings for a new society, because I think that to build meanings for a new society, we have to build meanings in the classroom with the children who are going to be the new society. And that's where my work has been done with SFL. So I want to talk today about what our theory of language, systemic functional linguistics, has the potential to offer teachers in their work with children because of its rich meta-language and its dispositions toward development of reflection literacy. So by building meanings in the classroom, in the context I'm working, it means helping children learn how to mean in a new language, children learning English. It also means learning how to mean in different school subjects. And we're doing that by helping the children recognize the meanings in texts and respond with their own meanings. Because SFL's meta-language offers a language for talking about language, functional grammar to connect language forms with meanings, and we're working on ways to learn how to use that meta-language to support teachers, to engage the children in talk about meaning in the text they're reading so that they can build their own meanings in their writing. Finally, in terms of reflection literacy in the title of my talk, I also want to pay a tribute to Ruqaiya Hassan, another leader of our linguistics who passed away this past year, and gave us this theory of reflection literacy, the idea that learning should not be just learning what's already known, that we need to engage children in developing a critical perspective as they learn and read and think, so that they can recognize the ideologies and perspectives that are in the text that they read and contribute themselves to the development of new knowledge. So this is Ruqaiya Hassan's idea of reflection literacy. I'm going to tell you today about a project I've been engaged in for several years with teachers in 6 schools in our area, where all of the children come from Middle Eastern backgrounds and most of them speak Arabic in the home. We used design-based research, an approach that lets us develop an intervention, try that intervention, study the trial, revise, and continue development, not just to create local curriculum, but to think about how a grand theory like systemic functional linguistics can offer some new pedagogical theory for teachers in the classroom working with children who are learning through a new language. So our goal was to develop approaches that use SFL to support children's language and literacy development. And I had many collaborators on the project whose names are listed here I'd like to acknowledge. So our goal was to situate the functional grammar of SFL in the curriculum to support the goals teachers had in two subject areas: English language arts, where children read literary texts and respond to them, and science, where the children in our context are now expected to read complex informational texts, even at an early age, and write arguments in response to those texts. So our theory of change in that context was that if the teachers could develop tools for talking about language in significant ways, they would be able to support the children's literacy development by engaging them in explicit talk about the meaning in the texts they read. So I'm going to take you in my talk through the series of activities that we engaged in as we, as researchers, learned what might work in the classroom context with teachers who did not know anything about functional grammar themselves and who needed new ways of supporting children in very complex literacy activities. At first, our approach was to help the teachers learn something about the many systems in the functional grammar that come from the theory. And of course, interpersonal meaning is the opening, the starting point for learning, as Ruqaiya Hassan has told us. And so we did some early activities with mood and speech function, even with young children. So these are children in year 2, 3, 4, and 5 that we worked with. And the teacher here is helping the children see how we say things in different ways depending on who we are and the way we want to accomplish something. In our work, we always worked with texts from the curriculum in order to have the children read a text more deeply, understand how the language works in that text, and then apply that new knowledge to write or speak themselves in new ways. So I'm going to start by telling you about a story that the children read called Officer Buckle and Gloria. Officer Buckle was a police officer who went out to schools and gave safety lectures to the children, giving them tips about how to stay safe in their homes and school. And he brought his dog, Gloria, along, and the story is very lovely. The dog performs behind the back of the police officer, where the police officer can't see the dog, but the children can. And so the police officer thinks his talks are so interesting because the children are so excited, when all the time it's really the dog they're watching. But the language itself in the book is full of commands, because he's telling them things like, don't stand on a wobbly chair, or don't cross the street without looking at the light. And so the teacher engaged the children in some talk about commands and the different ways we give commands, which led into a whole discussion about politeness and who can command whom, that showed the teacher some new things about what children, young children, are capable of. So I'm going to show you some of that work. She created a display in the front of the classroom. I'll just go back and show you this classroom again. So here's the teacher. Behind her is a chart that she's making. And you can see the children have their hands up. They were very engaged through the lesson. In fact, at the end, the teacher said, "I've never seen children so excited about a story." The children worked together to take sentences from the story and think about what is the mood of this sentence and what speech function is it performing, using this idea of offer, statement, question, and command as the four speech functions, and declarative, interrogative, and imperative, and of course as the mood. And of course we know from the theory that we can accomplish the different functions with different moods. And we're focusing now especially on commands because that's what the story had a lot of. So you can see you can command someone with a declarative. You need to be careful when you cross the street. Or with an imperative, keep your shoelaces tied. Always wipe up spills before someone falls. These were Officer Buckles' examples for them. But in the conversation in the classroom, some other ways of commanding came up that the children found very interesting to think about. So for example, if the teacher says, "Would you please sit down?" is that a command? If she says, "Can you sit up straight?" is that a command? It's the form of an interrogative, a question, functioning as a command. Even, "I'd like someone to close the door." How does that function as a command? Well, we know under some circumstances, especially the teacher, that can be a command. So this is the domain of meaning the children were engaged in talking about. So I have a little excerpt here from the conversation. The teacher is asking the children to give commands, and she says, "What's a command, Hassan?" And he says, "It's like when you're telling someone something like, 'Go to your room.'" The teacher says, "Right, this is the one we know mostly. Go to your room. Don't do this, don't do that." And then she says to another student, "Hussein, do you know a command? Can you give me a command?" And Hussein says, "Well, you just said one." And the teacher says, "Did I give you a command?" Now, the chart I just showed you had not been developed yet, and there were no commands like those on the chart. The teacher herself had not really thought about this functioning as a command. So she's processing this. And the students start talking. "Yeah, no, you didn't give a command. Yes, you did." They're all calling out. And she says, "What kind of command?" And one of them says, "You said, give me a command. Can you give me a question?" They're recognizing her question was a command. And she says, "What kind of command is that?" And says, "Oh, I'm interrogating. Okay, did I give you a command?" And they realize this is another way of commanding. So this takes them into a whole conversation about who can command and what counts as a command. And finally, at the end of the lesson, one of these little girls raises her hand and says, "Can I say a command?" And the teacher says, "Yes, please do." And she says, "I'd like someone to close the door." And the teacher says, "I'd like someone to close the door. Is that even a command?" And again, let's talk about it, and the children are saying it's a question, meaning you're asking us to close the door. And the teacher said, "Did she say, would you mind closing the door? That would be a question." "No, she didn't say that." And the teacher says, "She said, I'd like someone to close the door." She's giving a command, but she's more declaring. She said, "I'd like you to close the door," or "I'd like someone to close the door." So then they have more discussion about the declarative command. And finally, at the end, the same student here says, "When I said I'd like you to close the door, you could say interrogative, would you mind closing the door? And imperative, close that door." So this opened the teacher's eyes up to what these children are capable of, what kind of meta-language they're able to start using even early on. And activities like this got them very interested in the kinds of learning that we were asking them to do. Another system we worked with was to support reading comprehension by introducing the notion of process, participant, circumstance, the basic ideational meta-language. And I'll show you here a way that we worked with this. So in identifying participants, particularly, so these are grammatical participants, we started with stories and the identified participants that were mainly people, but now we're talking about even complex participants in a science text. And these children are reading about earthquakes, and the teacher wants them to focus on this underlined sentence about how the movement of the rocks against one another causes stress on the earth that results in an earthquake. And so I'm going to play just a little segment where she's working with the children to have them identify what's the whole meaningful chunk of meaning here that they need to recognize as doing the causing. What all goes together to say what causes this stress on the earth. Pause the sound and tell you what they say instead of having you listen when you can't see the words. So the teacher asks, what's the participant? And one of the children says, rocks. And then she says, is that, and someone says, the rocks. And then she says, is that the whole participant? And then they're all getting excited and they say, the movement of the rocks. And then someone says, the movement of the rocks against one another. And finally then, they've got the whole participant, and the children say, that's a big chunk. And so again, this notion of participant, shall I try playing it? I'll try it again. So the idea we had then was to use this meta-language to help children with their reading comprehension, with talk about language. And so after we had done some of these activities, we interviewed some of the children to ask them what they were learning from doing these activities. And I want to play you an excerpt from one of the 9-year-old children. She's been interviewed by the researcher who's having her read a text out loud and talk about what she's thinking as she reads it. So let's hope you can hear this, but it's written out here too. Oh, it's just not going to play. Oh. Okay, let me go back and stop this because I think if I hold this like this, it's going to work. Let me try. So you're going to hear what's written on the slide.
If readers found this text to be difficult, how might you use functional grammar or suggest that they use functional grammar to help them make sense of this text?
They should stop on every period and they should look which one is a process, which one is a word that it's doing, saying, or describing.
Okay. Can you give me an example of where you might do that?
Here. One dragonfly may eat hundreds of predators every day. They may eat hundreds of small predators, insects every day.
So what do you notice about that? Why would you point that out? And what functional grammar might you use to help somebody understand that?
I would go back and reread because you can look at the process, what they're doing, how they're eating, what they eat, and how much they eat.
So you can see that the children found it useful to have a way to talk about the language forms and connect them to the kinds of meanings. It gave the teachers and children a way of being explicit about how meaning is made in the text. However, so in our design project, the teachers enjoyed these activities, the children did, but they took a lot of time in the classroom, and the teachers in our context, as in yours, have a lot of goals they have to achieve. They can't just be doing new things every day because they think it's useful for the children. So we had to stop and think about how we could make the work with the grammar better serve the teachers' curriculum goals more deliberately and explicitly, because we knew that otherwise this work would not continue. They wouldn't take the time if they couldn't see that it's helping them achieve what they need to achieve. So I want to show you how we further develop the work, first in language arts, to support children in writing about the characters in the stories they were reading. So this was a common activity. The children did have to write about the stories and the character, how did the character change, or what kind of person is that character. And that draws on some of the genre pedagogy that some of us are familiar with, but not by thinking about the staging as much as what meanings need to be included in that text. So we wanted the children to be able to develop their own interpretations of characters and also recognize what our teachers called author's craft. What are the ways an author makes a literary story interesting and engaging? And then after that example, I'll give you an example from science where we supported learning from challenging texts, but also going beyond comprehending what the text says and learning to take evidence from that in order to write an argument. And then also to recognize that even in science texts, the author does have a voice and perspective, and that there are ways of thinking about the author's perspective. So first, the language arts goal of interpreting characters' attitudes. So one of the things we saw in the classrooms was that teachers talked about telling and showing, that authors sometimes tell us what characters think and feel, like they might write, "She was scared." But other times, authors show us what characters think and feel by telling us about their actions. "She hid under the bed" means she was scared. So this is a literary way, and the teachers already had this language arts meta-language of show and tell that they used in the classroom. They talked about showing and telling. And of course, when an attitude is shown, the reader has to make some kind of inference about how that action represents a feeling. So we asked ourselves the question, how can we connect the SFL meta-language we've been working with to this notion that the teachers are already using and want to develop? So what kinds of processes show and tell was the question that we asked. And we engaged the children in working together to do activities like this artifact displays. So the children had read a story about George Washington, our first US president, and there's a legend that children are told in the elementary school that when George Washington was a little boy, he chopped down a cherry tree of his father's, And when his father came and asked him who chopped down the cherry tree, he admitted that he did it. And the lesson we are all to take from that is that he was honest. We need to be honest. If you do something bad, you should admit it. So there's definitely a lesson to be learned from this legend. But we were interested in helping them see how authors show attitudes and how they tell attitudes. And so the children worked together to look at these sentences and circle the processes, write down what kind of feeling that process shows, ask if it's a showing or telling of the feeling, and then identify what kind of process the author used to do that. So this is the children reading and talking together about the language of the story. And you can see, for example, that George walked slowly into the room after his father calls him. He's chopped down the tree. Walked slowly is presenting a feeling of being scared, and it's a showing process with a doing, a showing kind of feeling using a doing process. So this is the kind of activity they had done, and that led us to this key generalization about attitudes that was useful for the teachers, and that is that shown attitudes, or ones that are implied, are often realized in doing or saying processes. So the author writes, George bowed his head and stared at his shoes. He was ashamed, embarrassed, or all right, he muttered. What is the feeling in that word muttered? So anytime there's a shown attitude, then it has to be interpreted to know what is the feeling. On the other hand, told attitudes are more explicit, and they're often realized in sensing or being processes. George was very ashamed. He thought he was going to be punished. This is telling you how he feels directly. And what the teachers did then to support the children's writing was to tell them that if they're going to write about the character and quote something from the story, if they quote a shown attitude, they need to restate that as a told attitude. So for example, if they're going to write as from the story, the quote, George's dad stormed into the room, they need to follow that by saying, George's dad is very angry. So when the author uses the shown attitude, they're going to use a being or sensing process to tell it. So this is not a rule. There are exceptions to this, of course, and we brought in exceptions so they would understand. We're not giving them a rule here, but a generalization that's pretty useful, especially for the stories the children read. So in this, then, we connected the meta-language of show and tell with the meta-language of process types to help children do something they needed to do, consider how authors present characters' feelings, talking about both the meaning and how it's expressed. That way, through this talk about text, the children develop these interpretations of the shown attitudes and can use them as evidence for claims they're going to make about the character as they write. So here's an example of the kind of writing. So George is a good boy because he was honest, so that's the claim. This is a kind of argument about a literary text. He nodded and looked up when his dad came into the house and asked, do you know who chopped down the cherry tree in the garden? After he found the tree on the ground. And now here comes the quote from the story. I can't tell a lie, George cried out. Then comes the telling. George felt guilty and upset inside. for cutting down the tree. This shows George is a good boy because he felt guilty and upset for his mistake, and so on. So this is the kind of writing that got supported by helping them quote something from the story that will support their claim, and then if it's a shown attitude, interpret it through telling. Along with this, then, we started developing a few other tools to go along. So the notion of attitudes and how they can be intensified or turned up or turned down. So you may recognize from the appraisal framework, this is the system of graduation we're talking about here. We developed the support of the attitude line, so the teachers all put an attitude line on their wall and had children think about how strongly expressed is this attitude. Is it positive or negative, and is it turned up or turned down? And you can see they had opportunities then to discuss the attitudes, and I want to show you how this worked in the classroom again. I hope we'll be able to see the subtitles here as you listen to it. These children are working with another story where two girls are best friends. One goes away for the summer, the other meets a new girl, and when the old friend comes back, she sees the two new friends walking to school together, laughing and talking the whole way. And they're going to discuss what attitudes are being expressed here about these two new friends. And they're going to talk about, is this turned up, and if so, how is it turned up?
Is laughing and talking the whole way positive or negative attitude? It is positive, okay? I like how you explained to me without even asking you. Would you please put laughing on the attitude line? Just the word laughing. Okay, who disagrees with her? Who agrees? Who has something more to say? She puts laughing here. Who has something more to say? Fatima. Sit down, Aya. Thank you. Where? Where's she? Okay. Do you agree that Fatima says move it to the positive, more positive? You're shaking your heads no. Why?
Because laughing is not a turned up attitude. It's next to neutral.
How can I turn it up? How can I turn it up? كيف فيني زود الشعور تبع laughing؟ إبراهيم. Okay, look at the sentence. You are 100% right, but look at the sentence. Did the author help me by adding something that will make it turned up? Which part did the author use to help me show that this is a strong attitude, a turned up? Ali. The whole way. So if I add laughing whole way كل الوقت, now where would I move this laughing whole way? Where would this go? Hanifa? It will be more intense. So it will be towards more to the positive. Okay, what does this show about the characters?
So we see several things happening here in this classroom with a teacher who also uses Arabic to work with the children when she sees that that's needed as well. we see them being able to offer different points of view. Because of course the attitude line, there's not going to be one specific right answer here. There's going to be debate about how turned up is that attitude or not, and it gives the children a chance to give different points of view. But also the move she makes at the very end, where she says, what does that tell us about the characters? This is the key step that links back to the language arts classroom, where it's not just about analyzing the language for purposes of analyzing language, but it's looking at the meanings in order to understand what's going on in this story. What kind of people are these characters? In addition, this kind of work leads to talk about author's craft that the teachers found very helpful. So here we have the teacher asking a question about author's craft. Why do you think the author used the wording he did? And the children have different ideas. Well, maybe so he could turn up the feeling. Or Zaina says, to show us more feelings about George and his father. Or Miriam, who says, he used the words because he wants us to feel part of the story, recognizing how authors try to draw the reader in and create empathy. Or so that we don't get bored. He used the turns up words so we don't get bored and don't get lost, so we read and see what happens next. So again, at this point, we were feeling that, all right, now we're connecting with the teacher's goals. We're doing activities that fit with their language arts purposes and what they want the children to achieve. So I'd like to give you one more example from the science classroom of how we continue to try to work along these lines. So in science, we introduced the notion of likelihood and the idea that when authors are writing about science, they often are not just giving facts, but they're telling us how usual something is, how likely it is to happen. And by having the children focus on how authors use that kind of language, they can start seeing how science authors choose their words carefully to be accurate about their findings and predictions. So many of these children, these are a little bit older now, so 9 and 10-year-olds, when they were asked to make claims, they'd make very strong claims. And we wanted them to see that scientists don't make strong claims. Scientists often use very tempered language. So we developed a unit about invasive species, and we used the Australian example of the cane toad, which is a terrible menace now in many parts of Australia. And there was a lot of information about different possible solutions. And so the students were reading texts about meat ants as a possible solution to control cane toads. And the language of the text has wording like this, where sometimes it's very definite, the presence of meat ants has not prevented cane toads from invading, but at the end, this increasing the numbers of ants could slow their spread. So we wanted them to notice where things were being claimed in strong language and where there was a little bit of likelihood language. So we introduced the likelihood scale, again, an artifact for the classroom. The children could practice, just as with the attitude line of thinking about where these challenging modal meanings fit on the scale. Of course, we know modality is really tough for English learners, what the strength of each of these modal meanings is. And so after they practiced that a bit, they used it to weigh the strength of evidence as they were preparing to write. So they read the texts in order to take evidence that they were going to use to answer the question, do you think that the scientists should use the meat ants to stop the cane toads? And so they were to choose what would count as evidence for that from what you read. So they're reading a text like the one I just showed you, and the teacher asks then, how likely is it that increasing the number of ants will stop the cane toads? And Zainab says, it's between definite and sort of likely, because it says right here, it has not prevented cane toads from invading the region. In other words, the cane toads are still coming. So you can see how it's giving them a way of talking about the strength of the claims. And so then when they're going to write, they can use that language. So one of the children has written, the cane toad's toxins don't affect the meat ants, but the text said the cane toad's toxins are not likely to affect the meat ants. And so the teacher draws attention to this and says, can we say that the toxins won't affect the meat ants? Are there any likelihood words here? What do we have to say, Ali? And Ali says, it's not likely, so it's not definite that they won't affect the meat ants. So again, both for reading and understanding and for their own writing, having this language of likelihood was a support for them in making claims and writing arguments. Finally then, the last example I want to share with you is about teacher learning as much as about children learning, because we also went on then, in addition to the likelihood language, to help them see how authors often infuse their own perspectives in writing informational texts, and to have the children start being aware of that language and how it's shaping what they are to take from the text and what they are to think. Well, when we brought this up to teachers, they were hesitant about it. They didn't really think informational texts had perspectives and attitudes in them. So this is our professional development group, and I'll just play you what this teacher says. The wording is there too.
I'm surprised because we've always taught kids that when you're reading informational text, you're not going to have to evaluate this piece. You know, there's no feelings involved, there's no... So,
We'll take another
I'm
look at
shocked
the
to see
information.
that.
So you heard her. She doesn't think that's true. So we worked a little bit more with her, and then she said again, well, when we're teaching fact and opinion, we say in your science book, they're giving you the facts. In your social studies book, they're giving you the facts. They're not going to be biased and tell you how they think about it. This is the teacher's perspective. So we did some activities to help them recognize author attitude and perspective in science texts. And one way is just through these interpersonal adjuncts where we see the author directly saying what is interesting or what is fortunate. And we have many examples, not just like this, but in other ways that authors bring their attitudes in. And so after doing those lessons, the teachers came back again for the professional development and to reflect after teaching. And here's what the same teacher said.
Because we had taught about the characteristics and the differences between narrative and informational text. And we had said that in informational text, when you're reading a social studies or a science book, you don't see a lot of opinion. The author doesn't give the opinion. And here we had to, see that there was opinion given. And 2 weeks prior to that, we had done a research paper on animals. And a lot of the kids would tell me, like lions are great, and I have to go back and say, you can't put your opinion in there, they're just researching this animal. So we have to go back and say, well, when do we give an opinion or an attitude, you know? And that, like Jason was saying, had they said like lions were important to the eagle.
So you can see that that teacher herself gained some new insights about it, but also asks that question, like, when do we give an opinion or attitude? That's a really great question to ask and to have in mind when working with children on informational texts. And then finally, just one more word from the teachers.
I just want to add a comment that probably you might know about the second part, the second question, raising the idea that authors always have an opinion, whether it's informational, non-informational, and teaching us educators to bring to the children's attention. In our 4th grade text, there is this sentence: every day we experience the wonder of electricity and give it very little thought. A child brought up, give it very little thought, is an opinion. And if you argue it, it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And actually, many of these children come from a part of the world where electricity is not something that they take for granted. So this talk about language and looking closely at wording offers some really new and interesting conversations to teachers in the classroom. So, I feel like we are moving toward understanding how to begin developing reflection literacy for teachers and children. There's much more to do, and I'm not suggesting that these particular activities are activities that would work everywhere, but just to think again that our theory of systemic functional linguistics offers us a lot if we can figure out how to use it in our classrooms. So in our case, it helped our teachers understand that informational texts present authors' attitudes and perspectives, and that this interpersonal engagement is achieved through the language choices they make, and that readers are in dialogue with the author and can bring their own judgments to what they read. They can have an opinion too. So we learned that the meta-language supports talk about language that enables teachers and students to connect language and meaning. We learned that our work became most powerful when we were able to figure out how to use it to support the teacher's curricular goals. This was a huge insight for us that really changed the way we thought about what we were doing. We're not creating linguists in the teachers. We're the linguists who can perhaps help them achieve their curricular goals if we can offer them tools from the linguistics that work for them. I'll just end by talking about what I think are some small steps toward reflection literacy that we were able to achieve. So for the children first. So for them, reflecting on authors' choices and how those choices of the author affect the reader, both in language arts with author's craft and in science with the authorial perspective, was something new and engaging and interesting. It enabled them to have points of view about what they read and share them, and it supported them in taking positions in their writing. For the teachers, they were able to engage children in new ways of talking about what they read and what they learned. And they liked that. They liked the kind of talk and interaction that the work supported. It helped them see new viewpoints from the children as the children actively engaged, because different points of view were brought up about things that they hadn't really thought about, and that led to more interesting conversations for them. And of course, it changed their perspectives on what the children in their classrooms were capable of doing, and that for us was the most rewarding part, was teachers who would come back to the second workshop. So we would do a workshop, ask them to try something, and they would say, oh, you don't know my children, they really can't do this, it's too hard. And we would say, they were really being asked to do this by the instructional leaders at their schools. They had to do it. And then they would come back and say, I didn't know how smart my kids are. I didn't know they could do it. But for us, as researchers, we also learned. So we learned about what's required to effect change in our context. What do we really have to do to make change? We learned a lot about that, and we learned that while we had some theory, we didn't have the answer for the pedagogical theory and the instructional theory. That we got by working with the teachers, the children, understanding their curriculum, and figuring out with them where we could have the most impact. We recognized that we needed to connect with the goals of the teachers and support them as we were introducing new ideas, that it had to be always in service of what they needed to accomplish already. And I personally also learned that I needed to work with the other educational research that the teachers were already familiar with. So the ways they talked about showing and telling, or the ways they were already prepared by their educational preparation to work in the classroom, we had to understand that, work with that, and see how the SFL could work with it. So I had a partner on the project, Anne-Marie Palinsar, who's an educational researcher in reading comprehension, and the questions she would ask would make me feel a little humble and have to think about, okay, that's a good point. We can't just have the meta-language be a labeling exercise. It needs to be going somewhere in terms of achieving the teacher's goals. So the main points here: close reading to get meaning in context using the meta-language, multiple opportunities for the children to comprehend and use that language that they're focusing on for expressing meanings, and then a lot of interaction. These are all really important supports for the work. So we want to build meanings for a new society. Children are the new society. So how do we prepare them to engage in building meanings that enable them to participate in shaping that new society? And I think as we do this, both teachers and children will gain new understanding of the power of language to shape our social world, and that this is the kind of reflection literacy that's needed to make the new society a society where every one of those children's voices is meaningful and contributes. So I look forward to our conversations over the next 2 days. Thank you.
Ahorita hay un espacio para preguntas. Abrimos este espacio, serán 15 minutos. Las personas que tengan preguntas, hay micrófonos allá al fondo. El que quiera hacer la pregunta, levante para que le lleven allá el micrófono.
The question is, what is the likelihood of this project to be spread out as an even state or national program? And because I feel that these children are not going to grow up to be Trump supporters.
They're going to be what? Oh. Let's hope not, yeah. So this was a project where we developed activities and curriculum very locally And the lessons we're drawing from it, we're publishing as ideas for using supports like the likelihood scale, the attitude line, like the notion that the processes meta-language fits well with show and tell meta-language, and that unpacking a complex noun group by thinking about whole participants is useful in science. So I think these are some insights that we got by seeing the work in action. But honestly, for me, the bigger point that I feel is coming out of the work is this idea that if we as applied linguists want to be powerful in schools, we need to forge collaborative relationships with other educational researchers and work in transdisciplinary ways to be able to address what the schools really want to be working on. And I think that's a lesson that needs to be promoted a little bit, that we can think that we have all this knowledge as linguists, and we want to go in and tell everybody and teach them linguistics. And, you know, of course I'd love it if every teacher had courses in linguistics, but that's not the world we live in today. And so I think thinking about new ways of working with teachers is really important.
Schleppegrell. I would like to know if in doing reflection literacy, are we doing critical literacy? I mean, is it the same? Is it similar? How?
I think so. Do you? So it's Ruqaiya Hassan's name, and I think we call it critical literacy. She called it reflection literacy, and she wrote a lot about the idea that we have the kind of literacy that we teach just to be able to repeat what was in the text. And we have the beginning literacy just to learn to read and understand. And then we have a kind of specialized literacy for science and history or whatever. But the reflection literacy comes then when we learn that we can also engage with that knowledge and develop that knowledge and contribute to the development of more knowledge. So maybe it's something like critical literacy, but even a little bit more than that, because it has to do with participating and not just taking it in.
Mary, thank you very much indeed for this very stimulating and encouraging talk. It's great to see something really positive going on. I was wondering if you could tell us something about the time frame. How long did you need to work with these teachers in order to achieve the sort of change in attitudes that you've told us about?
Well, I volunteered out in the schools for about 6 years before I got a big grant to do this work. So I had already established a relationship. This is a community about an hour from the university, as I said, an Arab American community. And I just had been going out, kind of doing things with teachers, helping them work with the stories in there. So there's some investment in teachers. I'll tell you, the very first meeting I had with the teachers in this district, I was invited by people at the state level. I had just moved to Michigan from California. And they said, "Oh, you've got so many great ideas, come and tell our teachers about it." And I said, "Well, are the teachers really wanting to learn?" "Oh, yeah, they need this." So they invited me. I walked into the room, the teachers are all like this. And I talked a little bit about, functional grammar and and one of the teachers, actually one of the ones here that you saw who turned out to be one of our most really best implementer of this work, and we learned so much from her. She said to me, she said, "I just want to tell you, if you think you're coming from California and you're bringing all these ideas that worked out there with Spanish-speaking children, and you think they're going to work with our children here, they're not." So that was my introduction. And I think we have to persist through that, you know, and build the relationship, because partly it's about that too. But also have colleagues that work with us who will help us make the linguistics relevant.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, in fact. There's a very interesting part. Everything was just very, very interesting. It's just that one part of your speech that caught my attention was when you mentioned these attitudes which are not said, but they are rather shown in discourse. Personally, I do similar exercises with undergraduate students, watching news reports, trying to figure out where the anchor man or woman is trying to convince them of something. Since they are mature students, mature learners, they came up with an interesting question I'm dealing with myself. When things are implied, when attitudes are implied, how are we sure we are actually reading appropriately what the speaker or the anchor man is actually intending to say? I have not been able to answer that question properly, or what should I say, I'm not satisfied with my answers so far. How have you faced these kinds of situations when analyzing these kinds of contexts?
Well, I think that's kind of like the you use electricity and give it very little thought example. So how is that read or understood by the person who hears it? Very differently in this classroom from in another classroom. What is implied, I mean, it's implied, that means different people will take different meanings from it, and that will vary according to their social positioning. So what I think is the important thing is to get all those different views expressed, and for the teacher to be able to sit back and be patient and not say that's the right answer, but to say, does anybody else have an idea about that? Or does anybody else hear something differently? And then what is the right answer? Well, sometimes there might be a right answer, and then that's the role of the teacher to help the students understand what kinds of meanings can be meant when that wording is used. But other times, there won't be a right answer to that. But I think this is one of the things so many people are really interested in working on, and you may have something useful to contribute to that. I'll look forward to hearing more about that.
Bueno, nuevamente, muchas gracias a la doctora Schleppegrell.